Going on to page 362, we have farming subsidies. And we have a picture here of cropland. We have some positives and some negatives of providing subsidies for farming. Positives, we have guaranteed income against a bad crop year, and it takes highly erodible cropland out of production. That was the Soil Conservation Act you learned last unit. The negative side of subsidies is that sometimes they support farms that degrade the soil, and it also makes unhealthy food cheap. So if we subsidize corn, most of it's turned into corn syrup and given to cattle, which makes beef cheap and corn syrup cheap. Two things that make people fat and unhealthy. Down here, you need to know about wetlands have been drained for farming. Make sure you know this law, the Swampland Act, which in the 1800s drained wetlands. And then over here on page 360, you can ignore that, that's my little note to myself. On page 363, we need to know about grass range land for cattle grazing. So livestock graze 1/4 of the Earth's land. And our range land, a lot of it is publicly owned and managed by the Bureau of Land Management, which from now on we will call the BLM. So know the Bureau of Land Management down here on page 363. On the next page, we have our national parks. So our national parks were set aside for the public to enjoy. No resource extraction, which means you can't mine and you can't log there. Those are resource extractions. The first national park in 1872 was Yellowstone National Park. The next two that came were Yosemite and then Sequoia National Park. A national park must be declared by Congress, not the president. The president can create national monuments, but it cannot create national parks. Congress must declare. You need to also know the term monumentalism, which is preserving really wonderful types of places on the planet. All right, on the next page we have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which manages our national wildlife refuges. It allows hunting and fishing on these lands sustainably, and also it administers the Endangered Species Act. So this is the Endangered Species Act. Its job is to make sure that it is running and enforcing the Endangered Species Act. You need to also know this law. The Antiquities Act in 1906 gave the president authority to designate national monuments without Congress. This is why sometimes you'll see a place that says, up by Mammoth, you'll see Devil's Postpile National Monument. It means that it might not be a big enough area for Congress to call it a national park, but it's a little small area, it needs to be preserved, and so the president can preserve it through the Antiquities Act. The National Park Service does several things. It's an organization that manages your national parks, your national monuments, your national historic sites, like a lot of the battlefields like Gettysburg, your national recreation area, and your wilderness areas. You also, let me take this note away, it's a little note to myself. You need to know about Wilderness Act in 1964. Basically, the Wilderness Act means that you can't have any impact on the land. So these are places that are set aside where there's no roads, no buildings, but people can go hike and backpack and camp in there, and it's designated as pure wilderness. Don't touch it, just leave it as it is, but you can go enjoy it as long as you hike in. Page 366 talks about the wise use movement in the 1980s and 90s. It was kind of a backlash to national parks and, preventing logging and that kind of thing. And these are people that wanted to preserve property rights, and they opposed government regulation. So these people said, hey, if I have a piece of land, I want to be able to build on it. I don't care if there's an endangered species that lives there. I want to build on my land. I own the land. And so they called themselves the Wide Use Movement. On page 367, make sure you know what a land trust is, which is a private organization to preserve land. An example is the Nature Conservancy. They own a lot of land in California, including on some of the Channel Islands. And basically, if Congress doesn't have the money, or a state or a city doesn't have the money, or doesn't want to preserve a piece of land, the Nature Conservancy will go in and they'll buy that land and preserve it. Make sure you know these terms on page 367, what a paper park is, a World Heritage Site, Biosphere Reserve, and UNESCO. On page 368, there's a really good example here of habitat fragmentation up here in Mount Hood National Forest. So some people own little pieces of land and they'll lease it out to be clear cut, and so you end up with all of this habitat fragmentation. It's kind of terrible. So that is on page 368. And going on to 369, we have a description of habitat fragmentation. They are disconnected areas for wildlife. One solution is to create wildlife corridors that connect these habitat islands. Now, it's a figure of speech. It's not really an island. It's just a piece of land that's disconnected from each other, and we call them habitat islands. And that is the end of chapter 12.